You had any instances where your immigration officers would have been involved in an instance where there was a passenger movement into Anguilla that was connected to firearm, the importation of firearms into Anguilla as well?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay, moving on. How safe do you and your officers feel carrying out your duties?
Well, from an immigration standpoint, in terms of that aspect, we more see the aggressive passenger or the aggressive person. In terms of officers and probably feedback that we would have had from them, lack of security in some instances. Even we can use the main office. We work in a building where there's absolutely no security. And you can have persons coming in there at any time doing anything, God forbid. At Marine Base, well, we have police there, so we'll depend on them. And then sometimes you do have officers who would complain from time to time with the lack of security at certain areas at the ports.
Have you had any reports from any of your officers, whether at the borders or the ports of entry or anywhere conducting the duties through Anguilla, that have been confronted by any threat of firearms or been impacted by the use of a firearm?
To date, I've never had that.
Never?
Never.
Thank you.
Ms. Bryan, there are certain countries that you may pass through that even in going through their ports of entry, you will see armed police officers, armed customs officers, and armed immigration officers. From your responses thus far, I see that the Immigration Office places a lot of reliance on the police department. But do you think that there's any scope, especially when considering that the task force deals with the enforcement aspect, which might lead to confronting people with firearms, that there's a need for greater security for immigration officers within the department rather than simply relying on the police?
Well, that's a very interesting question. That's a very live question as well, because just yesterday we had a meeting where we were discussing in terms of firearms, and definitely not across the board for officers, but within the task force, and even so it will be still specialized officers, because officers do joint patrols. They are out there. God forbid something happens in their presence. What do they do?
Ms. Brown, I have another question. Do you think there's room for a national law enforcement task force that is established to operate together from a particular office somewhere, as opposed to when there's a major operation that you pull up customs, immigration, that they would be dedicated to these functions on a daily basis to help Anguilla pursue some sort of activities against firearm crime in this country?
I certainly would support such. There is need for such. To me, there are more benefits to be derived in having such as well.
Thank you.
Ms. Bryan, you spoke earlier about your task force. When your task force are conducting raids or such, do they go alone or do they go along with police protection?
Certainly not. They do have police with them.
Ms. Bryan, this may be slightly out of the remit, but I just wanted you perhaps to even speak briefly about the relationship between immigration and labor as well, because we're talking about the movement of persons. We're talking about the ability to control what happens with persons coming into our borders and perhaps illegally working. So tell us a bit about that relationship that you have between.
Well, there's a very good working relationship between immigration and labor. We actually do some joint patrols together as well. We offer that support if officers are out there and probably there are persons who are working illegally, we would relay that information to Labor. So we do work very close with Labor Department.
Good morning, Miss Bryan.
Good morning.
Thanks. We appreciate your response in reference to Minister Kentis Rogers' question regarding if, per se, a passenger enters the island without a visa, that he or she is turned back. In the case of a minor or non-English speaking person, or even an individual in the company of a questionable person, what standards, what measures does your office take to, first of all, understand the situation, possibly protect the person? Because we're not only solely speaking about crime and violence and gun crime, but also human trafficking. We know it's a live issue also.
Well, we are very mindful of such within immigration. As a matter of fact, no minor should show up at the port of entry without the necessary documents. If a parent has a minor travel with, whether it's a friend or family member, there should be a notarized letter granting that permission. So we are very mindful about human trafficking, and we do not take those things for granted.
Okay, thank you. Okay, just wanted to, if you could elaborate more in terms of what sort of measures, what sort of actions would you take, for example?
Oh, in
Does your
terms
office
of the
take?
actions,
Yes.
definitely we would have to question. We'll have to question the minor's out because we cannot
Yes.
question the minor. We'll have to question the adult. Thorough investigations, we'll have to do that. And if there's need to reach out to other, whether it's social development or other counterparts, then we'll have to do that. But in terms of measures per se, we don't have no detailed measures in place. We just know that it's concerning if it happens, and we try to go about it the right way.
Thank you.
Sorry, Mrs. Bryan, what system do you guys use for determining whether a passenger moving through Anguilla has a record for a firearm offense?
Well, at the port of entry, that's basically only if it's in a watch list. Because remember I said we have OTRIS, so the information is there. Because if a passport is scanned and if you're on the watch list, it's flagged. So that would be the means that we would use.
And that is also for a record that has already been spent? So if there's someone who would have had a record for a firearm offense, and that firearm offense, the record would have been spent, they would have spent the conviction, would that person still be on the watch list, or they'd be removed from the watch
I
list?
truly cannot speak directly to that one.
Ms. Bryan, I appreciate that my next question might be a bit difficult for you to answer accurately because you genuinely may not know accurately, but please try your best. In the sense that we know that smuggling is an issue, human trafficking is an issue, but the two of them may not directly be tied. Some people might be purely into the act of moving persons for human trafficking, whereas you may have persons who come and go freely, but they're the ones smuggling. How tightly do you see the relationship between illegal entry and the issue that we have pertaining to smuggling?
Would you like me to speak with you off the camera on that?
If that's something you feel more comfortable doing, that's okay.
Okay, good. Thanks.
All right. I asked a similar question to the Comptroller of Customs a little while ago. Are there measures in place to monitor excursions from neighboring islands to ensure that persons are not illegally entering Anguilla waters and are abiding by our laws?
Well, persons entering, excursionists should enter at the port of entry. They are required to produce the manifest. They should just be doing what is expected in terms of measures. That's why we have the Marine base. We have the officers there. I guess it's an area where we can even enhance a bit more in terms of the overall monitoring. But like in terms of radios and that kind of stuff. But in terms of monitoring them fully, I would say we do at the point, but then it can be enhanced otherwise.
How often do you get on board to ensure that what's on the manifest, the names on the manifest, actually match what they declared?
Well, officers, they have a right to
Yeah.
board any vessel. So if there are concerns, they would do that. And that happens, actually.
Is it randomly, or does it happen with every vessel that enters?
No, it would not be every vessel, just if there are concerns.
Ms. Bryan, do you have a wish list to make immigration department the perfect department in terms of staff complement, in terms of technology? And with that wish list, do you have a dollar figure?
Yes, there is a wish list indeed. Full complement of staff. I probably would go, let's say, about maybe 65, full complement of staff for now. Full border management system. The last quotation I know we got, and that would have been like 1.3 million US dollars, yes, for a full-fledged border management system that would totally enhance our processes. And we, at immigration, we are looking to go paperless. You get tired of the files and those kind of stuff. And actually, we have actually streamlined a lot of our services. And so if we can get a system where we capture you an entry and we process you at the main office, and I can just sit and I can click approve or reject, and I don't have to be writing, we'd appreciate that.
For the full complement of staff, you say you will let, to go up to 65 would be perfect, that's what you said?
Well, for now, as of today's date, but then with future expansion, definitely you'll have to revisit that.
Sorry, what are your staffing levels right now? How many staff members are there? 51. Oh, 51. Okay, thank you.
Just one more question. This just maybe for this clarity for me. You spoke earlier about APIS and that we don't have it. Could you just explain a little bit what is APIS, why we don't have it, and what do we use as a substitute? This just for my knowledge.
Well, APIS, as I said, the acronym is Advanced Passenger Information System. And we don't have it, but we are actually looking to get it. We are just now waiting the legislation to go in place, and so we can have that. It just allows you to monitor persons. You would know who's coming beforehand. So for example, if there's someone of interest, we would know that. So we can make all the necessary arrangements at this end in terms of the arrival of that person. So it's basically a way to monitor two persons who are entering the country.
Ms. Bryan, we thank you so much for how you have answered these questions. You've answered them expertly, and we, the committee, thank you. We'd like for you to give your closing remarks.
My closing remarks. Well, gun crime, gun violence is all of our business, and I would hope that we can actually reach to a point where we can have a solution to the problem. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, this brings to a close our second session for today. We will close off for a bit, and we will be returning at 11:05 for our next session. Thank you.
Testing.
Testing.
Okay, welcome. We are back. Thank you, Ms. Johnson. So we'll now restart with our question from the Honorable Joseph Vanderpool. You can go ahead.
Sorry about that, Ms. Johnson, and to our viewers, apologies for the technical difficulties. So before jumping into the first question, Ms. Johnson, once again, as it relates to your unique perspective in the role as Chief Probation Officer, do you have any insights you'd like to provide us with as it pertains to Anguilla's current situation with gun crime and violence and the role that probation plays?
I think I'm a bit thrown off now. In terms of the unique situation that the Department of Probation plays, I think for us in our mandate of public protection, supervising offenders in the community, the management of risk more so, and recognizing that the department's task is one that when we consider that these are also persons who may have been imprisoned, the need for support and consideration must be even more so. As I said earlier, oftentimes I don't think from the department perspective we understand or see the scope of the issue because there's a process involved. And oftentimes offenders may not get to our attention because of the court process, because of a number of things. But certainly gun crime and violence is concerning for us because of what we're seeing, not only in terms of numbers, like I was saying earlier, the increases are not stark, but for a small community, quite significant. The ages at which we're seeing persons offending and those kind of things. So certainly for us, it's something that we see as quite serious and something that we consider a need for collaboration and support in addressing.
Before we go any further, could you please describe to us, the committee, as well as for the benefits of the general public, what the probation system is like in Anguilla? Because unless an individual or a family connected to an individual comes into contact with it, it might be a very abstract concept. So please.
Yes, thank you for that. And I think the whole criminal justice process is often something that persons do not actively engage with. If I may, in 2005, when I came into the post and actively supervised offenders and came to prison and saw the prison list, I thought to myself, do people know what's going on here? And oftentimes I still ask that question, you know, because the impact of offending and crime and violence on society, again, is quite significant. In terms of the probation process, the activities and actions of the probation department are guided both by the Probation Act, the Parole Act, and more recently, the Child Justice Act. So with regards to probation, an offender has to be found guilty or would have pled guilty to an offense. At that time, the court may order a pre-sentence report, which is the responsibility of the department to furnish. The pre-sentence report entails or details the offender's social history, speaks to the criminogenic needs of the offender, speak to static and dynamic factors that may influence the offending, and most importantly, provides a risk assessment to the court. The court, we once made recommendations. I think persons didn't like that we offered recommendations to the court. Anyway, so the court then uses the court reports to make a determination of probation, sorry. An offender can have a probation order, which is direct supervision, a combination order, which can be probation, supervision, and community service, probation order with condition of residency, which speaks to Zenada Haven. So in a nutshell, if you will, the probation order has conditions, and those are the conditions that the probation officers supervise. For instance, there may be a curfew component. We have to ensure that persons. There may be a counseling component, so we provide counseling. And the community service bit, we have to find community service placements for the offender. So in a nutshell, the probation officer makes what we call a supervision plan in collaboration with the offender, because again, the probation is not established to trap persons or fail them in the process. While we are court officers, we are also, in a sense, advocates for their best selves. So that's how we approach that. With regards to parole, a similar process. A prisoner makes an application for parole. A dossier is established. The probation officer writes what is called a pre-parole investigative reports, consisting of similar components, but again, most importantly, if the risk can be managed in the community. We provide guidance on that, and parole board makes a decision as to whether or not. Yeah, and so in a nutshell.
Thank you very much for that very detailed, though comprehensive description. I'm sure the listening public has a better idea. My final question before I retire temporarily and allow my colleagues to jump in. What limitations do you face in effectively carrying out your role, both in a personal capacity as well as a probation department?
Okay, how long do I have here? But I think definitely human resource capacity. I think for us, the investment in probation has been very limited. If I may recall, like I said to you, we would have been established in 2005, and we would have benefited from 2 scholarships in that time period, and I think some support in another capacity. Since that time, we've been struggling to fully staff the department to meet the offender management needs of Anguilla and on our public protection role. A simple thing as, I think, for me, getting a van to transport residents has been a challenge for the last 10 or so years. Again, fully staffing Zenada and supporting the requirements of the human resource development has been a challenge. Interest of persons in this area, community support and connections, because what you have to recognize, or what we recognize, is that probation, parole relies heavily on the engagement and support of the community. And oftentimes, some of the resources that we need are not vested in the department, and we have a challenge finding in the community. For years, we've been attempting to identify and source formal offender management tools, so that is absent from our portfolio. There is no formal risk assessment. Staff rely on structured professional judgment, and of course, with newer staff, it's a bit more of a challenge, so of course, there is more support in that area needed. I could go on. Yeah, but I think for us, it's the lack of staffing that is significant, causing strain to staff, because, again, we are required to do more with less, and the financial investment to ensure that we have the resources that we need for offender management. We have attempted, I think, maybe 3 or 4 times to get electronic monitoring in place, because you can appreciate that the physical once or twice weekly curfew checks cannot suffice. And certainly what can happen when officers leave his other people up and leave. So I have engaged in several companies over the years who have been to Anguilla, who have submitted proposals, and there have been no advancements in that area. So electronic monitoring is certainly an area that would assist with the supervision of curfew.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, just a follow-up question. Would you say that many probationers are falling through the cracks, or do you have a success rate that you can elaborate on?
I wouldn't say that they're falling through the cracks. What we recognize, the overall recidivism rate for the department is at about 12%. For adults, it would be less than juveniles. Juveniles, it's about 19%, and that's expected with young persons, that they're more prone to reoffend and often age out of crime, and that's what we're seeing. But certainly, I think there are a number of success stories that we have, but we don't want people to recidivize. We don't want persons to reoffend. And again, within a small community, the impact of reoffending, the impact of crime is so significant that you would want to see those numbers lessened. So I'm quite pleased with the commitment of officers, the feedback that I get, because I'm privy to all the reports that come. I was reading a court update, 2 court updates this week that are quite positive. There are persons who are working, who have good reports at work and those kind of things. And I think creating an environment of success, and oftentimes you would see that persons who come to the attention of the department are not persons who are used to succeeding in ways. So I think for us, when we provide opportunities for success and persons are seeing their potential, that lessens the wanting to commit crime. And again, we won't catch everyone, or we won't assist everyone, but certainly our aim is to be there and to be that stopgap, if you will.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. Ms. Johnson, while you're on the point of recidivism, I want to let persons know that is defined as reoffending, essentially. And I want you to do me a favor, Ms. Johnson, again, for the listening public. Can you please define parolees, probationers, and residents, please?
Alrighty, thank you for that. And and just let me comment on the recidivism component. When we look at recidivism, we're looking as Ms. Rogers-Webster said, it's reoffending, and our benchmark is within 3 years. If the person reoffends within the 3-year mark, we look at that as being a recidivist. If they don't, then we have no need to capture that. A probationer is someone who would have committed an offense and would have been given community supervision, a probation order, with conditions that probation officers are required to supervise in the community. A parolee is a former inmate, if you will, that an inmate would have applied for parole, would have gone through the process, come before the parole board, and would have been granted parole. Interestingly enough, I had a conversation with one of my officers this morning asking about the role in terms of parole. I said, but that's us. I said, do we need a name change then to add probation and parole? We may need to explore that, but that is parolee. Residents now, and residents are the young men that we have at our juvenile residential center. And we have, for over the years, been very specific about referring to those young men as residents. Oftentimes I cringe in public settings and private settings when they're referred to as inmates. And we have to appreciate that the labeling and the impact or impression of those weighty words on young persons can often be life-defining. So while we are not coddling, again, we have to recognize that young people's minds are still developing, and how our words impact that, how our actions impact that, and how we then, in our role as care workers, then can formulate new experiences for these young persons. Then they decide where they want to go. But at least in our capacity, in our hands, we are doing our best to limit those kind of quote-unquote traumas, if you will.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. You indicated that the percentage of reoffending is 12% for the parolees. Do you have the percentage for probationers and residents?
What I would have said, department-wise, 12% overall. We have not separated the parole and probation recidivism, but that is something, if you wish, that we can do. We have not, I must say, we have not seen significant numbers in recidivism with regards to parolees. But certainly, like I said, if those are numbers that you want me to look at, I would do. So, for young persons, like I said, the recidivism rate for the young persons are at about 19-20%, and for the adults, we have a 5.86, which is 6%. And those are numbers, that we can work with, and we expect that adults do not recidivize at as a higher rate as young persons, for reasons I would have kind of alluded to earlier.
Well, thank you, Ms. Johnson. I want to take us way back before the recidivism conversation to some more conversations about cause and effect as we're talking about gun crime and violence. So as Chief Probation Officer, you would be involved with the monitoring and evaluation of persons who have been at some point involved in criminal activity of all sorts, including possibly gun crime and gang activity. What do those persons who would eventually become probationers or parolees or residents say or indicate about the reasons why they participate in criminal activity related to gun crime and gang violence? I know that's a long-winded question, but we're really trying to get from you, from your interaction with persons who are residents and parolees and probationers, because they, through the conversations, through the reporting structures that we have within the Department of Probation, you would have some engagement about a lot of the historical context that they have or that they bring into the Department of Probation. So it would be good for the committee to understand, from your perspective, some of the reasons why those persons are saying this is where we were forced, this is how we were forced. A lot of them, this is the language they use, this is how we were forced into this particular role or area. So could you enlighten the committee to that regard, please?
First of all, they would never admit to being in a gang to us. That's, so we make certain assertions or assumptions with regards to that. What we've seen, though, generally, we've heard complaints of bullying, that being bullied and not supported or protected, not being these bullying allegations not being addressed. We have seen quite a number of young men with what I would call a father wound, in terms of the absence of a father, and then what then follows in terms of filling that gap. The lack of supervision in homes. A lot of children are raising themselves. So we've seen that. The other part, again, the feeling of not being successful or negotiating what success it can be defined for them. When sometimes I think back to my role as a teacher in terms of some experiences that I had that are also reflected in the young persons that we supervise. And again, this whole notion of providing opportunities for success, I don't think that we kind of understand that enough, that people need to feel valued and have a place for themselves and recognizing their worth within the space that they occupy. So that is quite important. Again, friends, the influence of friends. Again, I think I said that before in terms of connectedness. Yeah.
Ms. Johnson, how have you seen the activity in terms of the young persons, the criminal activity grown? Because I think you say you started with the department since 2005. Yeah. Have there been a marked increase? And also for you to address the ages of persons. Have you seen the age decrease?
And quickly, while you think of the response, added to question by Mr. Chair, have you also seen a change in the criminality of the crimes among the young persons? Thanks.
I think because the committee said the focus was on gun crimes, I think for us that was quite a bit of our focus. But what I can say from what I recall in terms of the statistics is that quite earlier on in our experience, we would have seen quite a number of offenses related to cannabis possession and that kind of thing. Over the years, though, assault charges, assault-based or violent-based offenses, that has increased. And the carrying a weapon abroad type of offenses, we've seen some increases there. And in terms of particular gun crimes, I think we've been only seeing the emergence of gun crimes in juveniles since 2009. Yeah? So since that time, we've had 7 crimes in terms of possession of firearm, possession of ammunition, involving young persons, as young as 13.
Sorry, Ms. Johnson, you said 2009 or
2009, sorry. Mm-hmm. So like I was saying earlier, we weren't seeing that. We were seeing more little fights, cannabis. Those were the majority of the type of offenses we saw in young persons committing.
Following up from that same question, could you share with us the age definitions for these crimes?
Okay, in terms of the possession of a weapon, in 2009, we had a young person, 13 years old, and up to 17.
And just for clarity, at what age, up to what age does the Senator Haven take the Senator?
18. So we house young men up to 18. I think back to the challenge, and this is still worthy of discussion. There's a conversation of whether or not our young men are being discriminated against because there's a residential home for boys and not for girls. I don't know if that conversation I can be a party to, but maybe the discussions are way above my head, but I just wanted to put that on the table as an existing discussion, because in 2009, when the residential center opened, it opened as a short-term interim measure, because the focus when I came on board was for a co-ed built facility. So from 2009 to 2023, short-term interim measure.
Okay, I have a question. You spoke about the reasons for criminal activity being lack of supervision, not feeling successful, not feeling valued, and also bullying. Are there conversations ongoing with different maybe community groups right now to try to tackle these issues, or maybe perhaps the conversation with government is taking place? Can you elaborate on what steps are being taken?
We're always open to collaboration. I think as a part of our activities for Probation Week, we would have done some sessions on bullying with the primary schools. That is something that we have done more frequently in the past. I think the challenge for us oftentimes with engaging schools is that they have a set curriculum and this, those interruptions. We have also participated with the PSHE programs at the high school, not in the more recent years, particularly on bullying. We have done the community desk as part of the Ministry of Social Development's outreach. I too have done the new program. So for me, in terms of information sharing, reaching out to the community in terms of what the work of the department does and the needs of the department, that is something that is ongoing. Also, with regards to support from our regional partners, OECS and UNICEF, the engagement with UNICEF continues to be a challenge for us in our position as UCOT, particularly in the support of residential care. I think when they would have started the Juvenile Justice Reform Project a number of years ago, Anguilla would have been ahead of the ball in terms of the establishment of our residential care, our policies and programs in place, to the point that they brought a 16-person delegation to look at our practice. But over the years, not having that support, again, because our position as a UCOT has stalled our progress in a lot of ways. So like I said, in terms of investment for us, but certainly our probation officers are always ready to dialogue. I'm always ready to dialogue. I know I would have presented on diversion to Executive Council at one point. So it's also a matter, not only do we reach out, but we are open to persons reaching out to us to support whatever initiatives. When I talk about achieving with the little money that we have, we often try to expose residents to their areas of interest. For instance, an example we have right now is a budding chef who came in not liking to cook, not wanting to cook, but having exposed him to courses at the community college and those kind of things. You find those happening. We engage our young persons in sports and football. We had one young man represent Anguilla as part of the national team and those kind of things. So, while sometimes you hear, oh, they're up there in the air condition and they're doing X, Y, Z, we have to explore what their interests are so that they can best know what direction they want to go in. I think one of our young men developed a special sauce that his father is now using at his restaurant. We had years ago somebody, president of the National Youth Council. So the opportunity, like I said, the opportunities for success is an important avenue to persons realizing their full potential. I think to your question in terms of the challenge now is the follow-up support that we see as a gap in the service once they leave our care. Is that, do families recognize this young person as a changed person and are willing to support the changes, or they say, oh, they're only pretending? We've had that. So we certainly recognize a gap in our service is that aftercare component, and have recently raised that as a part of our review that we're currently doing with regards to the Child Justice Act.
Just a quick question. Please paint a picture for us, the committee, and the listening public between the difference of how someone who is 16 or 17, and thus under the legal age of an adult, who is involved in an offense with a firearm or found in possession of an illegal firearm and ammunition is handled, versus that of someone who just crossed the line by a couple of months and is now 18 and 19. You have two groups of people, let's say a 16 or a 17-year-old versus an 18 or a 19-year-old. How is it handled if either of those groups, whether just above 18 or just below 18, is found in possession or in a crime where a firearm is involved or there's ammunition? What's the difference between? Well, whether by the court or through how does the process look? I myself, I'm not sure. Is it the case where someone over 18, 2 months past 18, they're immediately convicted, charged, sent to jail? And someone who's 17, because they're not 18, they're remanded to Zenito? What's the process like?
The process would be the same for any other type of offense in terms of if they're charged, if they're granted bail. They can be, if it's a young person, he or she, but he can be remanded to Zenita, and we've had that. Persons are entitled to bail, so we've had persons there on short stints and have been bailed. In terms of the sentences that we've seen for gun-related offenses, they do vary. And I could only assume that that is based, again, on the pre-sentence report, the conditions that the pre-sentence report would have detailed to the court.
I have a question here concerning how is the communication between the probation department and parents during the process of detention of the youngsters at the home?
Well, we believe in family engagement. You cannot break that because, again, you have to consider these are the families that they're going back to. So we have a family visit policy. So generally, family visits are on weekends. However, we are flexible based on the work schedule of the parent. We also have a family call policy for persons. If those persons choose not to visit, they can, call their grandparents or their little sister or those kind of things. Those happen every Friday. Parents are invited to, made aware of rather, of the challenges. Their monthly, what happened is a resident, for instance, if I speak to Zenita, has a key worker who works closely with that resident, so that person would inform the parents of any challenges that we're having with the young persons, whether success has been recognized, and those kind of things. So engaging the parents and families is quite important. Whether or not families are receptive to that, no, that's the other story, because we have had instances where persons choose not to visit or not answer their phones, and yeah, so, but.
The thing I would like to ask in relation to persons on parole, and I know in other jurisdictions, there's a sort of harsh street crime that are leveled at people who would have gone through the system, served them time, and been paroled. And somehow you get the feeling sometimes in our community, we are not prepared to accept some of these people coming back, even though we haven't had any sort of violence against some of them. Does probation play a role in terms of meeting families or the community in relation to receiving these people back into the community?
In terms of receiving persons back, we do engage with the families. As part of the pre-parole investigative report, we do speak to community members and we do ask questions in terms of this person has applied for parole, how do you feel about them re-entering the community, and those kind of things. But more so, our relationship, our communication is with the family. Are you willing to accept this person if they're in need of support? And what is your kind of financial position, if you can support them, and those kind of things. But interestingly enough, I think reception of persons is a mixed bag. Sometimes you do have persons willing to accept persons on parole. There are persons willing to employ them, and they settle in. They come to their visit, their meetings and appointments, and you hear very little in terms of, they come for support if there is need, and we're always willing to assist if there is a a letter that they need to write or those kind of things, or some outreach that is needed, they speak to their probation officer and assistance is offered.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson, for your responses to our questions so far. I have a couple of questions for you. First off, in terms of the limitations, you spoke about human resource limitations that we know can be an issue, and it may affect the quality of the welfare checks that you do. Could you share with us more or less, not necessarily how the checks are done, but with what frequency? And if it's also done when we have the residents, sometimes they get a pass for a weekend, is it also done?
I think I would have mentioned that checks are done once to twice a week. What happens currently, that you have officers pairing up. I think I'm doing a check next Monday. You have officers pairing up, and we go out into the community and we visit. There is paperwork to be signed off on. That's filed in their folder. If they're not at home, a violation letter is prepared, and they have to offer an explanation as to why they were not at home. Sometimes, like a curfew check, I don't do curfew checks regularly, but a curfew check I did a while ago, sometime last year, when we arrived at their home and we called, "Oh, I'm up the road, I'm up the road." I said, "Well, you need to come now. We're here," and he was there. So then we're not going to violate you on that, but appreciating that if we come back the next time and you're not, this is the expectation, So that's how we manage checks, and that's why I said. We have in the past tried to have the support of the RAPF, not in a kind of engaging way, but rather as a supportive way for us. That has not been sustained. So like I said, officers pair up and we go out into the community and address.
So that fits
curfew
directly
checks.
into my other question. In terms of the protection or the safety of your staff, going out in the, to do the welfare checks, you did share earlier in terms of an increase or change in the type of crimes that our residents are at Zenaida Hazen particularly for. You also spoke about a potential sort of strain on your staff, and there may be an increase in, I guess, changes in staff. Do you think, what sort of measures you have in terms of protection, and do you see sometimes a level of fear?
In terms of protection, like I said, unless we get the consistent support of the RAPF. But again, we seem to always have to re-engage. It happens for some time then. But in terms of protection of staff and concerns, of course they're concerned about their safety, and I have to appreciate that. But our options are limited. And that's why I have been advocating so strongly over the years for electronic monitoring. And outside of having that, we are often reactive. Outside of having that, I'm not so sure. And again, open to suggestions.
Well, is there some sort of agreement that could be signed between possibly your department?
We do have an MOU with the RAPF. It doesn't speak specifically to assisting with curfew checks, but it speaks to support, exchange of information, and what have you. But like I said, it doesn't sustain itself, because you would have an incident happen, and then when officers go to collect the officer, when I say officers, when my probation officers go to collect the police officers, there's no one available, or this person didn't say it. So there are a number of things that leads to some frustration by the staff.
Room for some further, I guess.
Yes, But in terms of how do we sustain it, I cannot speak to that.
Okay, my final question, in terms of the checks on residents who are given weekend off, etc., are they restricted into what activities or where they go when they're with family and the family care?
Not really, other than that they're expected to be in the care of their parent. We do not expect if they have their weekend passes, or what also happens when they are 3 months out of being released, their consistent weekend passes. So we expect that they're in the care of their parents once they are out. Yeah.
Thank you.
I just wanted to follow up on the earlier point about the welfare checks and ask you how effective are those checks?
I think I would have said earlier that we can't speak to the effectiveness of them, because if we're doing them once or twice a week, if we check at 7, I mean, there are times when we do swing back. There are times that has happened. But again, persons can up and leave, and that's why I said in terms of the electronic monitoring, that is what not only takes the burden off of staff, as in terms of such a human resource intense activity, but also ensures the safety of staff and also serves the purpose of persons being where they're supposed to be, because persons would be less prone to leave their homes if they have the monitors. Even the guy who just went up the road to buy some food, he wouldn't go, his girlfriend would go. You see what I'm saying? So those kind of simple things that, again, over the years, we have attempted to address, so like I said, electronic monitoring would definitely solve that.
Ms. Johnson, just a question in relation to your residents. So when your residents have their family, they usually have family visits. What has been your experience with parents on those community checks, which may not have been as successful as you would have hoped? Is there, in your experience, a link between the overall success of the resident and the level of support received from that parental unit or family structure?
I think that depends. It would depend, because what can happen, and I'm going through my mind in terms of cases that I'm aware of. What can happen, like I said earlier, you have a young person coming back to an environment that didn't necessarily support, that hasn't supported achievements in the past, so therefore doesn't support those achievements now, and then how quickly they fall back into a pattern. If I may recount a story of a young man who learned to bake bread, and many of the residents leave knowing how to bake bread, and went home and was told to go buy bread, and oh no, I can make bread, and then came back and reported that they, they didn't even thank me, or they, because like a big deal now, you've learned how to make bread. I can't even make bread, So like those kind of little things, and how, families support that reintegration is are conversations we have. And when I spoke to the gap in terms of where our supervision ends, that would cover that. I think the supporting family initiatives that the department is a part of is also, I think, is going to be a fantastic vehicle to ensuring that those things happen.
Just to follow up on that then, because we're talking a lot in the abstract, we're talking about anecdotal conversations with persons, but would you be able to quantify how many persons are on parole, are residents, and are on probation, for the general public to have an overall picture at the moment of where we stand in relation to those numbers? Of course, they fluctuate on a year-to-year basis, but if you could give us some idea as to the quantity, that would help the committee as well. If you need time to get that information over to us, we can
I
get that
can get
after.
that information
Okay.
because what I do know is that we have 2 residents right now, which is good for my staff, because last December we almost had a full house, well, not even December, like October, and a skeleton staff. So, so we do have 2 right now. We'll soon be down to 1, I think, at the end of August or so. So that's quite fine. In terms of parole, again, I could get those numbers because I was having a conversation with an officer who was saying to me that I think the parole numbers are overtaking our probation numbers. So I can get that to you. Yeah.
Ms. Johnson, are young people living in fear?
Yes, I can say I think they are. They're not going to admit to living in fear because it's shrouded in bravado and this need for respect, I think, but I think, yeah, I would say yes.
And if the answer to that question is yes, then what are the next steps? What are we doing to sort of reduce that fear? And is it fear amongst their peers? What is the reason for the fear?
In terms of the reasons for the fear, I think we are aware that the island is in factions. So the fear of not being able to go from one place to the next, we see that evidenced every time. I think I remember earlier on with community service, as you know, it's unpaid work and it's a placement. And we had persons saying, I'm not comfortable going this place, I'm not comfortable going that place. So as a part of our intake for community service, there is a section on the questionnaire that asks, do you feel unsafe going in certain areas? And we have to appreciate that and try to find placements in areas that they're more comfortable with. In terms of addressing the fear, how do we address the fear? How do we get rid of the factions? How do we have people understand that they're not more entitled to walk someplace than somebody else, so I guess I think it could only happen with continuous engagement, because what you find interesting, and what I've found interesting for us, is that at Zeneda Haven, again, they're not going to admit that they're part of any particular gang or fraction, but they're over there coexisting, sharing snacks. Seriously, what I will say is that when something kicks off, the whole corner, but generally, so I can't explain it, to be quite honest, So, we do have our conversations and we continue to dialogue, individual responsibility, accountability, those kind of things. But again, it's a baffling situation that, that we, yeah.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. My next question is going to be a bit specific. It's going to relate to students who are remanded to Zeneda Haven who are of school-going age, who are specifically involved in very serious offenses such as possession or firearm related. Now, these are school-age children, and we know that in Anguilla, any child of school-going age by law needs to be in school. And we are acknowledging limitations in place, but has it been the case, or is it usually the case that school-age children who are made residents are then reintegrated into the education system, and what does that process look like?
Yeah, for the most part, our young persons who are of school age are, if once they're attending school, I think once they're at Zenada, they're more regular attendees to school. We've seen that, but we engage with the education department in looking at what their education plan is, what our supervision plan is. So we have case conferences, for instance, with stakeholders, and in developing our residential plan, we kind of look at what the education plan is, and we liaise closely with education and ensuring the education of the young person, what shifts need to be made. We've had persons reintegrate from PRU into the main campus. That has required some additional supervision. We have a shadow system, if you will, where if we're concerned about the challenges of reintegrating from one campus to the next, we assign an officer to shadow the young person. Sometimes that is at the request of the school or just complaints that we've been receiving from the school. And we do that until we feel that the young person can sufficiently manage the environment. So there is a lot of dialogue between the Department of Education and ourselves with regards to the young persons who are attending school. We would attend the PTA meetings, we get their school reports, those kind of things. Mm-hmm.
Are there any other mitigation methods to, for example, give safety and security or give some kind of alleviation to the teachers who might be thinking they don't know if this student might be a threat to them? And for example, if that student steps out of line and they wish to correct that student, knowledge of them being involved in a firearm incident, if you see where I'm going with this.
We have not, at least to my knowledge, have that experience. I know that, in terms of a young person being involved in firearms, a resident at Zenada Haven, where concerns have been expressed about his or her education. I don't think I can answer that question because I don't think we've had that experience. I know I've heard of other experiences with regards to persons in the community on bail with regards to such an incident. But I think, and I don't want to speak to how the school handled that, but so I can't speak to that because we haven't had, in terms of a reaction or response from the school because of a young person involved in firearms. But like I said, when there is a general issue of behavioral concerns, or even safety concerns, we do implement our shadow system, where a member of staff accompanies the young person. And of course, if I'm misspeaking about that issue, I could go and do some research, because sometimes everything doesn't get to me.
Ms. Johnson, just a quick question. Earlier when you were detailing the reasons why residents may detail their activity, criminal activity or offending behavior, you were talking about residents saying that they've been bullied or something of that nature. Do you know who they're describing them being bullied by? Is it by their peers? Is it by anyone in the community? Can you detail for us who is the perpetrator of that bullying?
From our experience, it has been peers. But what they contend is they haven't been supported by the adults in the room. So that's what has happened. And I know, the ministry had conducted a survey some time ago where the understanding or the experience of bullying was represented differently by teachers than the same students in the class. So even in terms of what does that mean for the young person when I go, because you tell young people, go to the adult in the room, and oftentimes young persons don't feel protected by who are supposed to be protecting them.
Ms. Johnson, thank you so much for joining us today, and I think you've shed a lot of light on what your department does, and I think that in itself will be helpful to the community. I'll now ask for your closing remarks.
Okay. Well, thank you for having me here. And I'm leaving here wondering if I've covered everything, to be quite honest, because the scope of the work that we do, our role as, again, public agents of public protection, I think cannot be underscored enough. And when we think about the security of Anguilla, I often wonder why probation is excluded, because we're dealing with the same persons that prison engage with, that police engage with. So the support required, the investment required in the service that we offer, again, has to be considered in real and tangible ways. And we continue to serve.
Okay, to everyone, Ms. Johnson, like I said before, thank you so much for this most interesting session with us. We are now closing off our morning sessions. We will return at 2 p.m. So please join us then. Thank you.